Welcome to the VO2 Lounge podcast. Today, we'll be looking at how to get lean and stay lean forever. I know, terrible title, but it is what it is. If you clicked on this podcast episode, it's most likely because you have a goal this year of losing some body weight, particularly losing some fat mass. Now, you may already be a relatively lean individual trying to get very lean. Let's say you're trying to get sub 10%. Or because you are overweight in say 30-35% and would like to get to a healthier range, or anywhere kind of in between. Maybe you're 20% trying to get down 15, so on and so on. Now, by the end of this episode, you will understand the process of weight loss and the concept of energy in, energy out, why so many people struggle to keep the weight off and why they often rebound and go over their previous weight set point, the pillars of total energy expenditure and how their contribution is weighted between each other, the role of non-exercise activity thermogenesis or NEAT and what it plays in energy expenditure and weight loss on the whole, how energy expenditure changes with weight loss and why there needs to be some level of adaptation to things, and tools for keeping the weight off, and finally a look at some useful supplements, because everyone loves a supplement. The biggest takeaway from this episode that you're going to have is not what magic foods there are for weight loss or how much exercise you should do to improve your fat burning capacity or what biomarkers should you be looking at to understand where you are in your energy balance and how primed you are for losing weight, but how hard and infrequent it is for people to go on a diet, come off that diet, and also keep the weight off at the same time. A study titled "The Biggest Loser Thinks Long Term: Recency as a Predictor of Success in Weight Management" really does highlight this fact, but also the parameter which best predict long-term weight loss. So in their end discussion, they highlighted that weight loss in a weight management intervention is predicted by a recency parameter of the expectancy valence model, or EV. Now, successful dieters, according to the study, tend to consider long-term information in their decision-making, while unsuccessful dieters rely more heavily on recent outcomes. Now, the recency parameter was identified as only variable that will distinguish between successful and unsuccessful dieters. The study really just suggests that the ability to think long term contributes to significantly to behavioral change in weight management. Now, successful dieters, it argues, are better able to engage the difficult and effortless process of considering potential time-distant outcomes of their actions, leading to a successful habit change and weight loss. So essentially, rather than thinking it's like deferred and immediate kind of gratification, in the sense you place more emphasis on the long-term vision of where you're trying to get to. That doesn't mean every time you see a chocolate bar you don't have it, but the thing I usually refer to this more is, like, say at work someone brings in chocolates. Maybe it's more frequent depending on the workplace you're at, but when I'm in a period of time where either I'm conscious I've gained a little bit, or I'm just trying to come down a little bit more, or whatever the reason may be, is you can still have those kind of things, but rather than being like, I would love to have like 10 of these little chocolates, you're like, you know what, 1 or 2 is so nominal in the long term, but also pleasing you in the short term to some extent. But you're having that vision that, I'd love to have 10 and or a donut or whatever it is, and just pushing it down the road and knowing that the long-term goal is more value to you than the current period of having that treat. Now, the neuropsychological level is discussed, noting that individual differences in recovery correspond to differences in activation of the prefrontal cortex, a brain area linked to an inhibitory control. The study suggests that high activation in the prefrontal cortex precedes weight management success, emphasizing the importance of reflective system in decision-making process. The study draws connections between the two systems, model of decision-making, impulsive / motivational systems and reflective systems, and components of the EV model, sensitivity to reward and recency. It highlights that these components serve as behavioral measures of activation in different neurophysiological systems. The text acknowledges potential limitations, including the modest sample size, the lack of control for eating disorders, and the need for further replication of findings, and also mentions the challenge of addressing gender differences in obesity studies and decision-making patterns. But to wrap it up, and kind of the conclusion from this study, really, the study process proposes that the cognitive decision-making property of recency can predict success in behavioral obesity treatments. The findings suggest that understanding individual cognitive factors, such as the ability to incorporate long-term considerations into decision-making, can help healthcare professionals identify patients who are more likely to benefit from behavioral treatment. And then the text emphasizes the importance of moving beyond a one-size-fits-all approach in weight management, research, and practice, suggesting that tailored interventions based on cognitive factors could improve treatments outcomes. Now, this gives us a good starting point for weight loss methods and how really we need to think long term about these things. And it, to me, highlights a major part of my own methodology around weight loss and gain. So whether gaining lean mass and losing weight overall. And for me, these things in isolation can be a challenge to some extent. If I just woke up one day and I was like, I'm going to put on loads of muscle. I'm going to dedicate myself the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years to putting on 10 kilos, 15, 20 kilos of lean mass. Or the other way around of just saying, I want to be 78 kilos when I'm currently, say, 85. Those goals on their own, to me, have always been very challenging because there just doesn't seem to be a reason for it. Yeah, you can have the long-term vision of, maybe it affects your health, but particularly for people who are in the kind of 20 to 25% range, really, it's like you're perfectly fine. There's nothing really to worry about. Maybe you just want to be leaner because you feel like you look better or so on and so forth. But when you then have goals that are linked to an activity, so for example, the easiest I've ever found it to lose weight was simply when I was cycling, and the sport is driven so heavily by power to weight ratio, and so it was a byproduct of doing the sport. And the easiest I've ever found it to put on mass was playing rugby, where it's a byproduct of the sport. You just need to be able to take impacts, you need to be able to put impacts, lift people, do strenuous activity that involves moving mass, and as a result you put it on without really having to. Obviously there's a commitment to the process and eating and going to the gym, but when you're doing it and you've got a bad day, and when you say, for example, you're in this moment of losing weight, if it's connected to some form of activity, that really, I think, helps turn it into a long-term goal. But that's not great and doesn't help people who don't want to attach it to a sport. But maybe as we go further through this episode, something will help with that. Now, I do apologise for the tangent, but let's move on to getting on to the basics of this topic and what is weight loss made up of? Like, what are the components? How does it happen? So on and so forth. Which may seem pretty obvious in the sense that you're just losing weight, but let's go into a bit more. So, I think it is important to break down weight loss somewhat. Firstly, I would say there are two kinds of weight loss in this world, or at least two kinds of people looking to achieve weight loss. These people are people who can afford to lose some lean mass, and those who can't really. If you're significantly overnourished and overweight, then you can likely afford to lose some lean mass at the same time as losing fat mass. Say you're like 30, I don't know what really is a reasonable range, but 35%, like you're maybe 6 foot or 185 centimeters or whatever that it equates to, and you're 115 kilos, then you're in that category where you don't really as much need to think about the lean mass retention, simply because of how much mass there is and the huge surplus of huge energy reserves, meaning that there can be muscle saving characteristics of simply that process. And on the other hand, if you're someone who's already moderately lean and either targeting more of a body recomposition or simply do not have much lean mass on you, then you'll be wanting to reserve as much of this as possible. So that mainly there kind of affects the dieting approach. On one hand, it's just caloric restriction, just get it done. On the other hand, there also has to be some element of protein management where you are trying to encourage the lean mass to stick around by doing two things really. One is resistance training and the other is protein consumption. So that's the two kind of camps. But the calories in and calories out is essentially how all of this works. And some people say this is not true, or various reasons, including it didn't work for me, or that's too simple. Well, as you're about to hear, it is quite far from simple. And there are reasons that you may have counted calories and either stayed at maintenance, or should I say maintained weight, or gained weight, or whatever combination of something happening. So the calories consumed obviously comes from what we eat, but the calories you use or burn can come in various different forms. Now this can include resting energy expenditure, which is, as it says, an energy you use just existing. Exercise activity thermogenesis, which is energy expenditure from exercising. Non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, as you will probably know it, which is energy used by moving around, fidgeting, and the likes. And then there is the thermic effect of food, which is just almost the waste, the energy expenditure to consume, not to consume, but to process that food. Now, okay, so for these in far more detail, so starting with a calorie, really, because it's important to know, is simply a unit of energy. It's not some food tied item. You will get a calorific value of a liquid not in relation to how much, if you ate it, you would consume. It's just simply a unit of energy, so it can be referred to how much to change a fluid's or material's temperature by X number of degrees or so on. And we are trying to consume these units of energy to convert them into our own internal form of energy, which is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, and is as people will always refer to it as, the energy currency of our cells. So it's simply how we get about. It's not that we eat calories and that calorie itself is the thing that is like goes into the muscle. No, there's various things going on to depending on what you're consuming, whether it's a carbohydrate, a fat, protein, which affects many things, as we'll go into, but it affects its likelihood of ending up as different things, and so on and so forth. Now, where do we find these calories to count them in the first place for the whole energy in, energy out model? Well, obviously, we all know that that's from food labels on all the foods we buy that we can scan, or we can manually type into our fitness tracker app. What you may not know is that these food labels can be very inaccurate, and it can be up to 20% either side. So to keep things simple, Something labeled as 100 calories could be 80 or 120 or anywhere in between, and something that's 200 could be 240 or 160, and again, anywhere in between. So once we are up to a typical number of, say, like 2,000 calories, to just cherry pick a typical number a day, you could be eating anywhere from 2,400 to 1,600, depending on how the areas of your food stack up. So you can see how now this becomes a bit of a mess. Now, reportedly, I think these inaccuracies come from, one, just not necessarily quality control, but just when these golden numbers were drummed up, how maybe, say, for example, like chicken, the quality of the meat could have changed. It could be better, it could be worse. This source could have a higher quality meat. The individual blends of like yogurt or whatever can be different. It means that it's a big band. It's going to give you an idea, but it's meant to be apparently somewhat consistent, in the sense that you're not going to get the same brand of yogurt, the same Greek yogurt, and one pot has 200, the next is 240, the next is 230. Apparently it should be consistently outside of whatever it's stated, whether it is exactly what it's stated or something else. Which means if you're doing calories in, calories out, you use them as a baseline, but you use the scale as your indicator, effectively. Really, you can use that tracker is what it's really good for, to some extent, is going, okay, I'm going to have this food that I really like, has this many calories, how much stuff should I chop off to stay maintenance or stay in my calorie deficit, or roughly what foods could I have on my refuel days and not drastically sort of go over on my diet. Now, even with this, there's the added complexity of we need to consider that in some cases, like with insoluble fiber, like in plants, and the actual metabolizable energy within that very calorie count may again be lower than the amount you think you are consuming. So now you're completely disheartened or confused with the energy inside of the equation. Let's look at the energy out. Well, as I said, you have a resting energy expenditure or resting metabolic rate, which accounts for 50 to 70% of your daily expenditure. So the vast majority, even at the lower end, it's still pretty high. Now, the variation is mainly due to activity level. So someone who is more active will be closer to the 50%, and someone who's more sedentary closer to the 70% value, simply because the person active is spending more of their waking time moving, so naturally there's only so much time then left to be sedentary, and that contribute to your overall energy expenditure. So the thermic effect of food accounts for 5 to 10% of your daily expenditure. This is simply the energy needed to extract energy from those calories consumed. Almost a bit like the efficiency of something, meaning that again, to gain energy, there will be some energy lost. This is where the concept of not all calories being created equally kind of is born from. But that, I can think, can be sort of misinterpreted to some extent. It's not saying that the calorie measured in fat is somehow different to a calorie measured in protein, because it's just a unit of measurement. It'd be like saying a kilogram weighed in England is different to a kilogram weighed in the USA, or the age-old kind of what is heavier, a kilogram of rocks or a kilogram of feathers. It's neither, obviously, because they're both a kilogram, because they're both being used by an SI unit. So simply, they're the same thing. What is true is a sort of net caloric gain from different macronutrients. Fat could be considered roughly 97% efficient, as it's the easier macro to turn into energy. And so 100 calories of fat consumed equates to about 97 actually turned into energy. Carbohydrates are 90 to 95% efficient, and then protein would be 70-80% efficient. And that's where sometimes people are saying you can't get fat on protein, which obviously isn't true, really. I mean, yes, the thermic effect is greater, the satiety can be higher. Yes, it's unlikely that the protein you consume is then going to end up in adipose tissue. But if you were consuming, say you had a maintenance of 2,500 and then you decided to eat, and you were eating 2,500 calories, and then you ate an additional 500 calories of protein or meat, and some of it may be fat and so on, but that would then insinuate that it would all be muscle. But no, it's just the protein can act as a cushion to some extent for weight gain anyway in fat, because you've now got this protein available to do other tasks. So yes, a lot of it can end up in muscle protein synthesis, but it's not just, you're still going to have to provoke something to get it out. But anyway, now moving on to the physical activity, we have two forms: deliberate activity like running, cycling, walking, going to the gym, so on and so forth. Essentially anything that isn't like you getting up to go to the kitchen or getting up to go make a cup of tea or whatever. And then we have neat, which is non-deliberate, which is things like fidgeting, maybe you walk more often around the house, using your hands when you talk, so on and so on. Really, it's actually a very potent factor in people who are fat or weight gain resistant, and it's going to be the next thing we talk about. So how NEAT affects weight loss. Let's take this study, for example, the role of non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, in resistance to fat gain in humans, which is a 1999 study. Again, a bit like my last episode on how much muscle can be gained with and without steroids. There's a lot of these good studies that are from back in the day. I don't know whether there's not much in the financial incentive or whatever, or these studies were just good enough for the general community to put them to bed. But a lot of these seem to be a little bit older. Now, this study investigates the physiological basis of inter-individual variation in susceptibility to weight gain in response to overeating. Now, the researchers fed 16 non-obese volunteers 1,000 calories per day in excess of weight maintenance requirements for 8 weeks and measured changes in energy storage and expenditure. The key findings from this were 2/3 of the increases in total daily energy expenditure were attributed to increases in non-exercise activity thermogenesis. NEAT includes activities like fidgeting, maintaining posture, and other physical activities of daily life, as I've already kind of mentioned. The changes in NEAT were found to account for 10-fold differences in fat storage observed among participants. Now, this implies that NEAT plays a crucial role in regulating fat storage in response to overeating. Why it's there, I have no idea. I personally know, and to be honest, I hadn't really ever thought about it, but I mean, I'm not like a naturally incredibly lean person, but moderately so, just like within a reasonable range. But my NEAT in response to overconsumption is somewhat ridiculous. I had sometimes attributed, even if I'm because my mood is so heavily attached to how overnourished I am. Like if I'm towing the line a little bit or in a little bit of a deficit, just very unanimated, struggle to engage a little bit. If I go into a surplus, really animated, engaging a lot, making the conversation myself, my hands start moving, particularly, for example, sugary drinks, and like alcohol, for example, can have one drink and suddenly, like, I use my hands a lot more to speak and so on and so forth, and it's just very heavily that way inclined. Whereas obviously there are people the other way who clearly bear at storing fat and don't have this NEAT effect. Now, NEAT changes directly predicted resistance to fat gain with overfeeding. There was a strong positive correlation, a correlation coefficient of 0.77 between NEAT activation and resistance to fat gain, indicating that the individuals who exhibited higher levels of NEAT were more resistant to gaining fat. As I've said before, the correlation coefficient of 0.77, you can think of it as 77%, or a gradient where you've got 1, which is that like 45 degree, let's say, line, and then 0.77 is just like slightly down from it, and so it's how close you are to that overlay of the two values. The results suggest that humans overeat. The activation of the NEAT process helps dissipate excess energy, contributing to the preservation of leanness. Failure to activate NEAT may lead to the increase in susceptibility to fat gain. And obviously, to some extent, if you continuously ate this much, then no amount of NEAT's going to save you here. But it's more, some people could gradually over years put on weight because they're 200 calories over here, 200 there, 300 here, 400 there, and then these people with high NEAT maybe can rein that in because their body's able to like cope with a slightly larger surplus and still maintain mass. But to really like summarize the study, they highlights the importance of non-exercise activity thermogenesis in regulating energy expenditure and fat storage in response to overeating. The findings suggest that individuals who activate NEAT effectively are more resistant to gaining fat, emphasizing the role of NEAT in preserving leanness during periods of overfeeding. Now, don't get this idea that you can now start eating what you want and just increase your NEAT. This is something that is involuntary or subconsciously managed, and I mean, humans can be not a multitasking organism, simply switch between something quickly to another. The number of times I've been at work and maybe sometimes it is a slow day, you're not really feeling it, and you're like plodding away at a report or something, and you put some music in and you think you're still working, but you can clearly see yourself doing 2 minutes on, minute off, 2 minutes on, a minute off, and you're just lost in what's going on. And really, you just need some kind of blank noise in the background that you don't actually focus on. It actually just cuts out everything else and helps you focus. And so it's an example of, really, if you think about doing this NEAT, it's not really the same thing. And then arguably it becomes non-voluntary and it's no longer NEAT. I'd like to now take a moment to acknowledge the sponsor of this episode, the share button. The share button allows you to share content like this podcast and many other bits of information with all your friends in just a few simple taps. Studies show that 90% of podcast growth come from a combination of clicking the share button and word of mouth alone. Only joking, I don't actually have any studies that prove this, but I dare you to make a group with 10 of your closest friends or closest like-minded friends in relation to this podcast episode and share it with them in that group chat. I dare you. Thank you, and back to the episode. Now for part 3, the rebound. Keeping on the topic of how we rebound to diets, let's take a look at 2011 paper titled Biology's Response to Dieting, the Impetus for Weight Regain. Now, this paper discusses the challenges of weight loss and the high incidence of weight regain, particularly in the context of dieting. Now, the review emphasizes the limited success of dieting as a long-term weight reduction strategy and highlights the biological factors that contribute to the problem of weight regain. I think even without going any further, if you're calling something a diet, it insinuates that there is then going to be a return to some kind of normality, which involves basically returning to where you were before. So it has to bring it back to the long-term prospect concept. There has to be some form of permanent change or adaptation in the way you go about eating food. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't eat any rubbish. It just means if you eat 4 pieces of rubbish a day, or like you have pizza 6 times a week, for example, like a Domino's pizza 6 times a week, that there's low-hanging fruit there in just eating regular meals 5 times a week, and then maybe having a piece here, a piece there of other kind of things. Now, for some people, it's one, let's just stick into the language people tend to use, 1 cheat item a day. It could be a pack of popcorn, it could be like a small chocolate bar, like a single serve chocolate bar, it could be, I don't know, whatever people's guilty pleasures are. It could be that every day. Or maybe you're someone who needs to build it up and have a more indulgent experience. Now, these can still be, for the most part, still legitimate food. Like, say, for example, a homemade burger. You've still got possibly high quality meat. There's protein, it's nutritionally complete. You've got carbohydrates, you've got fats, you've got protein, you've got some vegetables, and so on and so forth. But maybe just the head count for it is too high to be having on a regular basis. So you stack it up onto, say, the weekend, and maybe that's the days when you go back onto maintenance. Let's say you've got 5 days of restriction, 1 day at maintenance, or 2 days at maintenance. Maybe that's the day you use that. It's an additional 400 calories that brings you back up to maintenance, and you've enjoyed that meal, and there you go. There are so many ways to go about this. It's just, you need to figure out something permanent. So while dieting can lead to short-term weight loss, which everyone knows about, it is noted to have a relatively poor success rate for long-term weight reduction. Most obese individuals who lose weight through dieting eventually regain weight. And the prevalence of overweight and obesity is a big public health concern, particularly in the US, affecting over 60% of adults, close to 20% of children. A huge amount. I mean, the fact that 20% of children, I mean, you haven't been on this earth long enough to become obese yet. Still, I suppose overweight is thrown in there, but still, it is kind of crazy. Like 6 in 10 people that you see will be overweight or obese in the US, the United States of America particularly, I think. It's kind of crazy. Now, effective weight loss strategies are often only transiently effective over a period of 3 to 6 months. Less than 20% of individuals who attempt to lose weight are able to maintain a 10% reduction over a year. The high incidence of weight regain, now over 1/3 of lost weight tends to return within the first year, and the majority is regained within 3 to 5 years. This high incidence of weight regain is considered a major obstacle for obesity therapeutics. So I think the reason that's such a long-term win, a lot of people maybe listening to this have just had like a diet where they go from 90 to 85 or whatever your kind of reduction has been, and then you can put it all back on in 6 months to a year. Obviously this long-term 3 to 5 years, these must be significantly overweight people for it to sort of take that long. I suppose you could still creep back up, but it seems more like logical. Now, the review aimed to examine the role of biological response in the process of weight regain, and it suggests that biological adaptations to weight loss involve comprehensive, persistent and redundant mechanisms in energy homeostasis. Now, the discussion also acknowledges that there are unique features of the adaptive response to weight loss in overweight or obese people, and understanding these adaptations is pertinent to therapeutic development. Now, the differences in weight recovery, they mention that the central and peripheral adaptations involved in weight recovery can differ based on one's starting weight, and these differences may provide insight into the effective targeting homeostatic system in individuals who have difficulty controlling their weight. Now, the challenge is obviously countering the metabolic drive to regain lost weight is identified in the significant challenge for obesity therapeutics. And it's just going to get it's harder, it really suggests. But the key takeaways really from it are they emphasize the act of dieting and deviating from the established steady state weight acts as a trigger, awakening the body's kind of defense mechanism to return to where it once was. Now, the ensuing biological response is characterized by the persistence, redundancies, and the clear focus on restoring the body's depleted energy reserves. Now, critical role of acknowledgement and planning. So weight loss strategies that fail to acknowledge and plan for this emerging metabolic influence are likely to achieve limited success and facilitating long-term weight reduction. Now, they also contrary to a resigned acceptance of weight regain inevitability, the review highlights that the biological drive to regain lost weight can effectively be countered. The counteractive measures involve environmental, behavioral, and pharmacological interventions. Now, the influence of diet composition and physical activity they also address, and the composition of the weight maintenance diet, specifically featuring high protein and low carbohydrate content, significantly influences various aspects of the homeostatic response. And then physical activity and regular programmed exercise play pivotal roles in shaping this response. Really, that's also a lot of that is about obviously protein and fat, particularly not having really glucose spiking effects, mean that especially when you're going through this process, keeping your blood sugar curve as kind of flat as possible so that you don't have these cravings and hunger spikes and over satiation followed by a massive drop in how satiated you are can help drastically. This then use of physical activity, especially like low intensity cardiovascular work, can help dispose of, even if it's something like a walk that's like 40 minutes long, can help dispose of glucose around meals and also help flatten the curve more and help manage things. And yeah, trying to do a high carb diet of losing weight can be a bit challenging just because the glucose spikes are going to be all over the place, really. Depending on how overweight you are already, you could be incredibly insulin resistant, and it just becomes even more of a mess, really. So now they also have some proactive regain prevention strategies by acknowledging the emergence of these homeostatic pressures. The review advocates proactive development and implementation of comprehensive strategies to prevent weight regain and ensure success. These regain prevention strategies are proposed to mirror the characteristics of biological adaptations they aim to counter by being comprehensive, persistent, and redundant. But the review really concludes that underscoring the significance of understanding and addressing the biological underpinnings of weight regain, by adopting a proactive and comprehensive approach, clinicians and researchers can develop interventions that effectively counteract the intricate, persistent biological pressures, ultimately improving long-term weight management outcomes. Essentially, the most part, the takeaway from it is that a lot of the world is overweight, at least in the Western developed world, but also that the weight regain is going to be inevitable unless you identify it, acknowledge it, and put in place methods at which you are going to prevent it. And that, I think, the biggest method of preventing it is by not going on a diet in the first place. Actually just changing your existing diet in the sense of what you eat, how you eat, and when you eat on a regular basis, but keeping in the things you like. Because it could be, for some people, they eat poorly out of how maybe being lazy to some extent, or having long work days, or whatever it may be. So sticking to the convenient stuff, but rather than, for example, being very crude, rather than having a takeaway or multiple ready meals, or a ready meal that isn't very satiating followed by a couple of chocolate bars to satisfy your desires, even though it's more costly and maybe arguably to some real purist not healthy, but like a microwaved rice packet with some kind of like pre-steamed vegetables and then some pre-cooked chicken, like it, you can still keep the ease of the meal preparation. It can be eating together more, say you have a partner, and cooking meals together and taking them, altering. It could even be, especially in the UK where we can do online shopping and food delivered to our home, moving from a in-store based shopping process of going to the shops, buying stuff, going one step further than arriving to the shops full, right? So you don't buy the Kit Kats or whatever, because trust me, if I go to the shops full, it doesn't matter. I see shiny stuff that looks like it tastes good, I'm gonna buy it. Instead of that, it's just not going in there in the first place, getting it all delivered to your house. That way it's even more awkward to find the bad food online. And then my way of just still eating kind of what I want is like, if I go for a walk at lunch with people for like 40 minutes and I go to a shops and I fancy something, I'll walk in and I'll buy something that I fancy. But if I had gone to shops and bought 8 things that I fancy so I can have something like that every day, then it's a completely different situation. So it's finding these, I don't like the word necessarily a hack or a dieting hack, but it's finding these little things of pushing things out of the way and getting them out of reach and making it so it is harder for you to consume habitually or overconsume habitually, and then making poorer long-term decisions. Now, there is another factor we need to consider, and that is how our energy expenditure changes during our weight loss and weight gain process. A paper titled Changes in Energy Expenditure with Weight Gain and Weight Loss in Humans gives us some idea on this very topic. I'd actually recommend pulling up this paper, as there's a really good figure in the final part of the paper that explains everything I'm about to summarize. But for those just looking to listen and not looking to see the paper, here we go. Now, the paper outlines the differentiation of adaptive thermogenesis, AT, in the context of resting and non-resting energy expenditure, various phases of weight loss and weight loss maintenance. Here's a breakdown. So, differentiation based on components of total energy expenditure, or TEE. So, resting versus non-resting energy expenditure. The first issue involves differentiating AT in relation to the individual components of TEE, considering both resting and non-resting energy expenditure. So, differentiation based on phase of weight loss. So you have 3 phases, so they overview the process as such, which is phase 1 in immediate control, phase 2, which is proportional changes in energy expenditure are proportional to weight change, and phase 3, weight maintenance, the regulatory system impacting weight maintenance after weight reduction. Now, phase 1, the mitochondrial carbon load decreases, ATP demand is met by mobilizing endogenous sources such as glycogen and triglycerides, so sugar and fat. Losses in functional body mass and AT contribute to reducing ATP demand. characterized by depletion of glycogen stores. Then weight maintenance, AT, is triggered by a loss of body fat. Leptin fat mass association serves as a second set point to keep energy expenditure low and prevents triglyceride stores from getting too low, safeguarding basic biological functions like reproduction. Now, the discussion involves set point feedback system designed to match a target and settling points control system without a set point in body regulation. Two set points with a settling between them. Now, so first set point decreases in glycogen stores, triggers AT, and the second set point, leptin fat mass association during weight maintenance, preventing triglyceride stores from getting too low. Settling occurs between these two set points. Now, lower thresholds of liver glycogen or negative fluid balance associated with glycogen depletion trigger AT in early starvation, possibly related to the energy needs of the brain, because obviously glucose powerhouse, it needs glucose. It doesn't want anything else, it just wants bloody glucose. Now, AT does not occur after glycogen depletion in response to an isocaloric ketogenic diet and moderate weight loss, so possibly due to increased plasma ketones providing an alternative fuel to the brain. Now, during weight maintenance, a lower margin of the leptin fat mass association serves as a second set point. This keeps energy expenditure low to prevent triglyceride stores from getting too low, preserving the basic biological functions such as reproduction. So that's essentially how all this energy expenditure changes. You can imagine essentially that your energy expenditure is going to go down as you lose weight because you are physically a smaller human. That's what I was talking about, the ATP demand going down as you lose weight because there's less biologically active tissue there. But there's ways to mitigate it with activity. But to some extent, it's like you're just a lighter, smaller human being, so you just need less food. There can be a bit of metabolism tanking not tanking, but dropping a little bit. And then as you come up back to maintenance, it can raise and or plateau and settle a little bit more. But just be wary during that maintenance phase. Maybe there's a little bit of fettling, fine tuning, but you can just jump straight up to it and then just see what happens. It's not like you're going to wake up the next day 3 kilos heavier. So this is where weighing yourself, which we will come to in a second, is very critical in maintaining weight loss. At this point, I do recognise that it's been a little convoluted and we haven't exactly overtly spoken about how it is you lose weight. Well, that's really because it was addressed right at the beginning to some extent by saying that you need to be in a caloric deficit. How much? Well, probably something on or below 20% of your maintenance value, which you can figure out with some trial and error. There are calculators online. You can mess around with that, see if that works out. It could provide you a rough estimate, but you can figure this out. Or you could track weight, seeing as this is the end goal after all. A study titled Consistent Self-Monitoring of Weight, a Key Component of Successful Weight Loss Maintenance, from 2012 gives evidence for regular weighing as being an adequate tool for successful weight loss and management. And honestly, even without weighing, like reading this paper before that point, that has been one of my key metrics. I have I think it's a Xiaomi smart scale or something. You can buy really cheap smart scales now that self-zeroing, record body fat or whatever, but all I care about is the weight. And every single day you can step on there, it sends the information to your phone. You have a log of what you weigh over the course of a week. Do it at the same time every day. Wake up, go to the toilet, come back, weigh yourself, or if it's in the bathroom, you go to the bathroom, weigh yourself. I have to go into the toilet. And then you just have a really obvious metric for knowing when you're losing weight, when you're gaining weight. And it's simple. it's just easy. You go, okay, I'm trending upwards, or I'm maintenance. I haven't changed for 2, 3, 4 weeks. Like, I want to lose weight now. So you look at your diet. If it's fairly consistent, and you can go, okay, the easiest thing to do is take some calories out of that breakfast, or that lunch, or that dinner, or remove that snack, or change that snack for a lower calorie snack, and be on your way. And then you have a readily available, consistent, repeatable, and daily method of knowing what's going on in your body. Now, back to this study. The objective, this study aimed to investigate the characteristics associated with frequent self-weighing and exploring the relationship between self-weighing frequency, sustained weight loss among individuals enrolled in National Weight Control Registry. Now, the research methods were participants in the study numbered 3,003 and were members of the NWCR, which was that National Weight Control Registry. To be included, individuals had to achieve a weight loss of at least 30 pounds, maintaining that weight loss for a minimum of 1 year, and complete the baseline self-weighing frequency assessment upon joining the NWCR. A follow-up assessment was conducted 1 year later, with 82% of the participants completing said study. Now, their results were, at baseline, 36.2% of the participants reported daily self-weighing. Those with a higher self-weighing frequency exhibited lower BMI, highest disinhibition sources, and increased cognitive restraint scores, all within normal ranges. Now, participants who decreased their self-weighing frequency experienced greater weight gain, talking in the order of 6.5 kilos, compared to those with an increased frequency, approximately 4, whereas with an increased frequency it was only about 1. Now, and then the people with an unchanged frequency, 1.8. Then this is at the 1 year follow-up point. Changes in self-weighing frequency were associated with alterations in other parameters of weight control, with those decreasing their frequency more likely to report increased caloric intake from fat, higher disinhibition, and decreased cognitive restraint. Importantly, the change in self-weighing frequency was independently associated with weight change. Now, the consistent self-weighing emerged as a potential valuable tool for successful weight maintenance, allowing for individuals to detect weight gain early and make timely adjustments to prevent further increases. And notably, a decrease in self-weighing frequency was independently associated with greater weight gain. This underscores the significance of regular self-monitoring, and particularly through consistent self-weighing, in facilitating vigilant weight management and supporting long-term weight loss maintenance. And it's just kind of obvious to some extent. I mean, imagine it's like looking in the mirror, isn't it, really? It's easy to put on, I don't know, let's use a number they used of 30 pounds over the course of 2 years when you never weigh yourself, whereas when every day you step on the scale and you see the natural fluctuations, but then you also see the trend upwards, I think it's pretty easy to then feel like you need to take some kind of action, even if you kind of yo-yo a little bit, but it's just you yo-yo at like a reasonable mass rather than way up in the range. And now onto the internet's favorite topic, and that is supplements for weight loss. It's important to say though that you will still need to be in a caloric deficit. These are just tools that can be used to help make the process that bit easier or more effective, but they are more high-hanging than low-hanging fruit. Obviously, to some extent, protein should have been included in this list, but it's not really weight loss. It's more strategic weight loss and trying to target fat loss. But anyway, the 2020 review titled Current Evidence to Propose Different Food Supplements for Weight Loss, a comprehensive review, gives a pretty comprehensive overview of all the possible supplements that do and don't work. If you have some time to kill, then it's worth a read, as it could almost be a subject of its own episode. But the proposed food supplements combination leverages multiple mechanisms of acting to aid weight loss and improve metabolism. Each component plays a specific role based on the current state of the art in nutritional science. And here's an overview of the proposed supplements and combinations. So, green tea, mechanism of action, inhibits pancreatic lipase, amylase and glucosides in the gastrointestinal tract, reduces nutritional absorption leading to undigested carbohydrates in the GI tract, drives the microbiota to produce short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs, and inhibits lipogenesis and induces lipolysis through the AMPK-dependent mechanism. PVE, active ingredient, contains phaseolin and amylase inhibitor. Mechanism of action is impairs the absorption of carbohydrates. Impairs, not stops, impairs. Caffeine suppresses hunger, stimulates energy expenditure, increases excitability and the sympathetic nervous system, increases fat oxidation, and activates brown adipose tissue, which I have actually discussed about in an episode on hot and cold exposure and cold water therapy and so on and so forth. And if you'd like to know more on brown adipose tissue, go there and you'll understand why it's maybe a little bit nominal in its benefits. Okay. Capsaicinoids, I don't know how you pronounce that. Anyway, CAPSAICINOIDS. Activates the TRPV1, leading to GLP-1 release, increases fat oxidation, increases SIRT1 expression, and suppresses ghrelin release, increases adiponectin, PPARA, and the PGC1A expression, regulates glyconeogenesis and glycogen synthesis genes, improves insulin resistance, all the things you would possibly want. Then you also have L-carnitine, improves insulin resistance, increases acetyl coenzyme A and glucose supply to the brain, increases energy expenditure, facilitates the transportation of activated long-chain fatty acids into mitochondria, plays a role in B oxidation, and modulates beta oxidation, and modulates lipid metabolism. Resveratrol increases SIRT1 expression, decreases the adipogenesis and viability in maturing pre-adipocytes, modulates lipid metabolism in mature adipocytes. The list goes on. You've got lipoic acid, which increases GLUT4 expression on the cell membrane with the skeletal muscles and adipocyte cells, leads to an increase in glucose uptake, improves glucose tolerance. There's a few things else on that list. I don't think it's worth going through all of them, but essentially what I will always take away from supplements and their effects on weight loss is that they are a tool. It may be something that I honestly think even the placebo effect can be greater. And really, if you're at the bleeding edge of weight loss, then yeah, I'm sure these are probably worth looking into, and supplements and so on. But for the most part, get the diet dialed, get yourself in a caloric restriction. Exercise is almost something that needs to come after as well. If you're like a cyclist, a runner, a footballer, a rugby player, or whatever, you're already exercising, and then you're going on a diet, fine. If you are sedentary and looking to go on a diet, don't start running and go on the diet at the same time. Pick one, do that first, get that underway, then creep the other one in. So don't do them at the same time. It's just not good. I acknowledge that I haven't spoken about different diets and what foods you should be consuming at this point. That's because after a short look at studies on these diets, they all generally have very poor long-term outcomes. So I think it would be unfair to really harp on about any of them. I did do an episode maybe a year ago at this point talking about common weight loss diets. And essentially, yes, a lot of them, when combined with a calorie deficit, result in weight loss. Long-term outcomes for most people are poor. If you're someone who's taken up a ketogenic diet, a vegan diet, a paleo diet, or so on and so forth, and the weight loss has come easy and the diet is sustainable and you're 3 years down the line, then great. It's not to say that they cannot work for anyone. It's to say that if you really struggle with food, it's an added level of complexity that probably will make things harder. It may not, but it could very well do so. And the literature kind of supports the fact that these tend not to have the most positive outcomes. I always look at it as, look, you're gonna have to restrict stuff, and it's finding the form of restricting things that feels least restrictive to you. At times that to me has been carbohydrate restriction, but then when I'm racing and riding my bike a lot, carbohydrate restriction feels incredibly painful. So it starts to have to come from volume in some cases, cutting everything down. It can be food types, it can be no longer cooking with certain things like, say, coconut milk, or having the lighter version, or removing yogurt from breakfasts, for example, so on and so forth. It's also worth touching on protein very briefly. As I said before, depending on how much muscle mass you have, you need to consider how much protein you're consuming to keep the muscle on you. 2 grams per kilo is often the gold standard value to consume while losing weight. But if you're only hitting 1.6 grams per kilo, it's not going to be the end of the world, unless you've got some serious muscle mass on you that really should not be there. That's not in a negative way, but say you are like incredibly muscular, then your body may decide it doesn't need that anymore. So you really need to have a strong stimulus, which is going to be, say, for example, 2 grams per kilogram in combination with resistance training. Don't forget about the resistance training. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating, and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the vo2lounge@gmail.com or in the VO2 Lounge Discord server, links all below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it is goodbye.